The world of Coruscant is considered the center of the galaxy for a reason. It rests on a fulcrum of several key hyperlanes, and it is home to trillions of beings, all of whom live within the city that is entirely covering the planet's surface. Coruscant is often perceived as the further one gets away from the world, the less developed the worlds become. But this couldn't be farther from the truth. It's a mistake to believe that Coruscant was the only ecumenopolis in the galaxy. An ecumenopolis is a planet covered by a city which has multiple layers, but there was another one just like Coruscant that existed in the Outer Rim. In today's data logs, we are going to be exploring the planet of Taris, a world once considered to be the Coruscant of the Outer Rim. But while some think the capital of the Republic is difficult to live on, they should consider themselves extremely lucky that they didn't grow up on Taris. It was rife with civil unrest, rampant speciesism, crime, and deadly disease, all building karma that would eventually culminate in it being crushed into powder by the Sith. So make sure your blaster and your medkit is handy, because we're descending into a planet that makes Coruscant look like a utopia. Taris lies on the Outer Rim in a system by the same name. The planet rested on two very important hyperlanes, the Hydian Way and the Mandalorian Road. The Hydian Way was a route that stretched unbroken from the galactic north all the way to the galactic south, linking together a string of very important worlds. The Mandalorian Road was a short stretch from Mandalore that passed all the way through Taris and made it to the world of Coruscant. This was integral in the formation of the full length of the Hydian Way. With these two hyperlanes, this made Taris an extremely valuable location on the galactic map. However, it was settled relatively late in comparison to the other worlds, and it wasn't until sometime in the Mandaron period, which was the Republic history from 7000 to 5000 BBY, that the settlers first arrived on the world of Taris. The original settlers were human, though their origins are completely unknown, and upon first landing, they colonized the planet and built a city underground at first. The original city became something of a legend to future inhabitants of the planet, as they began to call it the Promised Land. At this point, the world of Taris was largely covered by trees, vegetation, and oceans, making it full of life with plenty to eat. They would eventually become governed by the Taris Civil Authority, which quickly began construction on a gigantic city. They were aware of the important place in the hyperlane and wanted to take advantage of this as soon as possible. And by the year 5100 BBY, the landmass of Taris was eclipsed by a gigantic city. This would be the first of 4 layers that would eventually make up the Ecumenopolis. Unlike Coruscant, which had thousands of levels, Taris had less time to develop, and so it had 4 distinct levels. This very first one was the surface, and would eventually become known as the Undercity, the underground promised land which separated the rest of the city by large, sprawling sewer systems. In the year 4600 BBY, population continued to spread, and so another layer would be built, soon becoming the Lower City. Only 200 years later, the Middle City would be built on top of it, with the Ecumenopolis capping out in the Upper City in around 4300 BBY. By this time, the Promised Land was completely abandoned and was gradually becoming forgotten. By now, the entire landmass had been buried by steel and duracrete, and the Tarisians were unable to keep any sort of livestock or crops on the world. As a result, they became dependent on their oceans, using kelp as their main source of food. But their troubles would come to an end when the Republic took notice of them and would bring them officially into the fold. Resting on such an important hyperlane gave them immense trade opportunities, which of course opened up immigration. Soon the primary human planet became heavily inhabited by aliens and non-human species. The city planet was a major hyperspace transport hub, making it incredibly wealthy, and it was here when it gained the nickname as the Coruscant of the Outer Rim. And for a glorious 144 prosperous years, Taris was an economic rival to the galactic capital. However, the world wasn't truly a planet-spanning city. Unlike others, Taris contained an ocean that could not be built over, and because of this, the planet quickly suffered from overpopulation, and only the Republic kept it from falling into total despair and anarchy. But the world would suffer a sudden and a harsh decay that began in the year 4156 BBY, when other, more convenient hyperlanes were discovered which links the core to the Outer Rim. Suddenly, the Hydian Way was only one of many hyperlanes rather than a singular one. This sudden drop in trade and commerce was a huge blow to the Tarisian city, and in the ensuing decades, the planet saw a rapid urban decay. Without the Republic, the businesses died out, and commerce began to shrink. To maintain the planet's economy though, Taris turned to industry, switching to a new, cheaper power source, but this produced toxic waste as a byproduct, thus slowly polluting the once pristine ocean. In just a century, the kelp farms and most of the marine life, which Taris greatly depended on, was completely destroyed. Crime began to sweep as residents began to clamor for a way to keep their lives going. And at some point, an unknown event would see the introduction of the Rakghoul plague in the Undercity. Rakghouls are horrific flesh-eating creatures that were created by Sith alchemy. They are one of the oldest diseases of the Sith, being among one of its first inceptions. One of the original 12 Dark Jedi Carnus Mur is attributed with the Rakghoul's creation. These mindless troglodytes are aggressive and actively seek out other sentients to kill and consume. A single bite or a scratch from one of these creatures will infect the sentient, no matter the species, and eventually, they will become a Rakghoul. It is a rapid and a painful process. A cure would eventually be synthesized, but it only worked up until a certain point. Once someone turned into a Rakghoul, they were now beyond help. Not to mention the cure was expensive and difficult to come by, so many of the lower class that lived in the Undercity were completely out of luck. Soon, Rakghouls overran both the Undercity and the sewer systems, and every now and then, the Rakghouls would wander their way into the turbo lifts from the sewers into the lower city and would attack the residents there. But luckily, the heroic residents managed to fight them back and stave off the disease. But all of this was only the beginning of the problems that Taris would face moving forward. After several decades of Taris's ecosystem dying from pollution, famine, and swept away in the planet, panic and greed of the upper class turned to hoarding and remaining kelp and marine life solely for the rich. By 4056 BBY, the starving lower class engaged the nobles in a civil war, with millions of innocents dying and large sections of the world completely destroyed or abandoned. Ultimately, the nobility prevailed and had the rebels all taken in a mass arrest. However, the prison systems could not hold all of them, as it was almost the entire population of the lower class that had revolted. And so, the nobility turned to one place worse than prisons: the Undercity. This began the tradition of banishing all lawbreakers into the Undercity, unable to return to the surface under threat of death. And that extended to not only criminals, but also to their children and their future descendants. This bred an entire civilization of people in the Undercity calling themselves the Outcasts. They built a village, but suffered from starvation, Rakghoul attacks, and infections. All hope for them was lost, save for the prevailing legend of the Promised Land. Many who had rebelled during the Jedi Civil War were non-humans, which then created a massive prejudice against alien species in the upper levels. It got so bad that they banished all non-humans to the middle and the lower cities. No aliens were allowed to enter the upper levels without a permit under direct threat of punishment. And Terra society was so bad that it pretty much was impossible to ascend to success out of anyone's social or economic class. Their only hope was to work hard to eventually save up enough money to leave the planet altogether. The remaining kelp, along with the remaining oceanic fauna, was consumed to extinction by the Tarisian nobles, after which they were forced to rely on imported food entirely. Naturally, all of this gave the planet a bad reputation to off-worlders no matter what species. And in the years leading to the Mandalorian Wars of 3964 BBY, crime became the main government of the lower city. No police ever went down there, and justice was purely theoretical. Soon it was run by gangs. Groups like the Hidden Becks organized themselves to make life easier for the poor community, and would use their muscle to enforce a facsimile of the law. This made them the de facto authority in the lower city. But others, like the Black Volcars, were violent and simply wanted to oppress the lower residents to feel powerful. Gangs in the lower city got worse as they fought for more power, and their main vehicle was the Swoop bike, which they also used to compete in the Great Tarisian Great Swoop Race. Thus, the term Swoop Gang was coined for these criminals. Swoop racing would soon capture the imagination of the galaxy, and using an intricate system of hyperspace beacons, Tarisian race organizations broadcast the results in their swoop races throughout the entire galaxy. This eventually gave rise to a huge and a profitable gambling operation. The Crooked Circuit Corporation even got involved, and they decided to completely fund the gambling event. Although not as classy, this gave Taris a foothold back in galactic society and gave the people a reason to care about it. Taris remained a hub for swoop racing for decades, becoming the center of galactic swoop racing circuits. And at this time, the criminal organization known as the Exchange based itself off of Taris, as the civil authority accepted bribes to keep quiet and keep their collaboration under wraps. When the Mandalorian Wars broke out though, Taris became a staging ground for the Republic's war against the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders. Due to the planet's proximity to the warfront, it was perfect rallying place for the dissident Jedi who were led by Revan. The Mandalorians fought hard for control of Taris, even managing to dissolve the Taris civil authority, driving the Exchange off of the world. In this power vacuum, crime swelled to unbearable levels below. This caused the Industries, a mining company which employed half of the planet's lower class in its operation, to completely and finally abandon Taris. This left millions unemployed, as rioting began as the government completely collapsed, even spreading up into the middle levels, setting the entire section of the skyline on fire and kidnapping the planet's senator. But things were about to get worse. Due to the political anarchy, the Jedi based on the world were recalled to the temple on Coruscant, abandoning Taris to their horrible fate. And with that, Taris was also largely abandoned by the Republic military as well. Without the protection of the Jedi and the Republic, the planet was taken by the Mandalorians. The criminals, the Hidden Beck Swoop gang, formed an underground resistance against the Mandalorians though, and would fight in the Republic's stead for the remainder of the war. Once the Neo-Crusaders were defeated at the Battle of Malachor V, those that were still occupying Taris were ejected from the planet, and soon, the criminal exchange of the Circa Corporation would successfully retake Taris. Things would completely turn around during the Jedi Civil War, when Malak's Sith overran nearly the entirety of the Outer Rim, leaving Taris as the last valuable planet in the region still under Republic control. This reinvigorated interest in Taris again, and a small Republic force was stationed there. In 3956 BBY, the Republic managed to make a stand on Taris, and the ship known as the Endar Spire soon arrived to the planet to bulk up the existing garrison. Several important members of the Republic war effort were on board this ship, including Cartha Onasi, Jedi Knight Bastila Shan, and Revan. Revan, who recently had his memory wiped and was currently under the impression that he was a Republic soldier and Jedi. The Endar Spire was ambushed eventually, however, by the Sith, Darth Malak's forces, as several escape pods were launched from the ship, with Bastila landing in the lower city, and Carth and Revan landing in the upper city. Sith forces quickly invaded the planet, as Malak ordered a wide-sweeping search for Bastila and Revan. The Tarisians had no resistance to the Sith occupation, and the Imperial forces crushed all Republic opposition. The Sith then quarantined Taris to make sure that no one could get in or out. Revan and Carth navigated their way through Taris, asking around, and even dealing with the lower city gangs and the Rakghoul plague while attempting to find Bastila. They eventually found that she had been captured by the exchange, and was then being sold as a slave. Revan managed to win her freedom in a swoop race, and infiltrated the exchange's headquarters to claim a ship known as the Ebon Hawk, which was their only means for escape from Taris. Meanwhile, Darth Malak had grown impatient in search for the Jedi, and ordered his fleet to bombard the world. They rained down hellfire from their broadside cannons, annihilating the city on the surface. Taris would be destroyed unnecessarily as Revan and the crew escaped the bombardment aboard the Ebon Hawk. As a result, the upper city, the middle city, and the lower city were completely destroyed. The rubble from those levels landed on the surface, which crushed most of the Undercity, flattening much of the sewer system below, and perhaps worst of all, badly damaging the promised land beneath. During the Sith occupation, Taris had a population of around 6 billion, which was far dwindling from the past, but after its destruction, it was closer to 600, with the outcasts of the Undercity being the only survivors. At the time of the destruction, they had been making their months-long exodus from their village to the entrance of the Promised Land, which had now been located once again. But Taris' karma finally caught up to it, as the whole planet would pay the price. Inversely though, Taris' destruction and the slaughter of its entire population ended many of the planet's issues. This included decaying skyscrapers, the Bek-Volkar gang war, the Sith occupation, and the exchange influence, as well as the Circa Corporation funding, and species and class oppression. Soon, after 200 years of the planet slowly dying, the city was put to a painful rest. When the outcasts finally reached the Promised Land though, the underground city was vastly different from the legend, or at least, after Taris' destruction it was different. What remained of the Tarisians had made it safe, and saw the realm was sheltered from the bombardment, but they found that the buildings, equipment, and the generators had all been destroyed. Therefore, the outcasts had to begin anew. And while this was difficult, they had survived the bombardment, the attack that had killed billions. However, many generations had passed since then, and they kept memories of this terrible apocalypse. The cure to the Rakghoul plague that Revan had discovered was enough to protect the first few generations, but after the Rakghouls evolved to a new advanced level, it was obvious that the serum became useless. And to make things even worse, babies were no longer born immune. Not only this, but the Rakghouls began learning to use weapons, even blasters, and some became sentient. The sole group of survivors eventually renamed themselves the Tarisians. The outcasts returned to the surface, hoping to rebuild their world from scratch. But this too was in vain. they continued to die out on the surface from starvation, disease, and Rakghoul attacks. In the last surviving recording, it was mentioned that the last generation had lived with almost no information about what their world was before. They didn't even know what had brought them there, and soon, hundreds of them now only numbered 12. And one by one, they quickly dwindling to the point where not a single human remained alive. This was largely due to toxic waste in the water that they were drinking from, which resulted in their extinction like the rest of the planet's population many years later. Eventually, the Rakghouls became the only living species on the entirety of the city planet of Taris. Taris remained a smoking ruin for the next 300 years. Trees and vegetation regrew during this era and nearly consumed the entire ruins of the city. But the Republic was simply in too much disarray to allocate any new resources to help reconstruct Taris, and so the Coruscant of the Outer Rim was officially labeled a dead world. During the Cold War of 3653 BBY, the Republic would return to Taris with an initiative to rebuild the planet though. This had come following the humiliating defeat to Vitiate's empire, which now ruled half of the galaxy. The Republic decided to rebuild Taris after so long amidst all of the chaos, making it a beacon of hope to all the citizens of the galaxy. It would show that the Republic would preserve and rebuild during this era of despair, and the Sith soon picked up on this and would ensure that those reconstruction efforts would never happen. To undermine this message of hope and to crush it, the Sith sabotaged the Republic's efforts, and Taris remained in complete ruin, thus ending the planet's history. The story and tragedy of Taris is one after the other. It began and died within the days of the Old Republic, and although it was rebuilt and repopulated by the time of the Clone Wars, it is a shadow of its former self. It is a terrible history and reputation that kept it from ever growing back to the shining place that it had once been. And the Republic hardly wanted anything to do with it because of what it now represented. It was a mirror of social decay that was soon to grip many other worlds. It was a fear of what could happen if they grow too far and too fast, and if only Coruscant had paid better attention. But anyway, my friends, thank you so much for joining us in the archives today for this story in Holocron, and as always, may the Force be with you.